Hello, my lovely people. I'm back with another feedback session today. If you haven't watched my last video, I recently asked around on Instagram if anyone would be willing to send in some artwork for me to critique. And I got a few responses, and I'm very, very honored to have gotten these responses. So now I am going to record feedback sessions for each of these people. Today I'm going to look at art by Anaski. They sent me a couple of the artworks, all of them stunning, beautiful. So I highly recommend that you check them out. I will link their stuff in the description. Please go like their artworks, give them a follow. They absolutely deserve it. They are a highly skilled artist, and I'm so honored that they sent me their artwork to critique. In the email they mentioned that environment art is actually not their strong suit. So I want to look at this amazing piece that they sent in and give my 2 cents on this. I mean, this is great already, but there are a few things that I would do personally to make this even better. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, let's take a closer look at this beautiful painting now. Like right off the bat, this is a very successful environment painting, and I know that you said that environments is something you struggle with, and this is something that I do not see when looking at this painting. I cannot tell that you're struggling with environments. That is something that you're still actively trying to improve, because this is very successful. It works in a lot of ways, and if you left it like this, it's already a great painting, right? So all I'm gonna do now is go over this and tweak a few things here and there that I think can maybe make the painting pop a little bit more and make it just slightly more successful than it already is, okay? So when I look at this, the first thing that struck me about this, looking at it from a critical perspective, of course, is that I'm not really 100% sure what the focal point is. And logically, of course, I can kind of deduce that the focal point is supposed to be this beautiful dragon, shrine / waterfall / fountain thing, but it doesn't really pop out to me as the focal point. If we paint something, and I feel like this is especially true for environments, we kind of want to make sure that everything enhances the focal point. Everything that we utilize while painting, whether that be composition, whether that be color, whether that be values, everything should kind of enhance the focal point and make it very, very clear what we're looking at and why. And I just feel like, especially when you zoom out far like this, the shrine, the fountain, it kind of disappears a little bit into the back, right? Because not only is it pretty small inside of the painting, it only takes up a very small amount of real estate in the painting. It's also very light. There's very little contrast around this area. So when I glance at this painting, the first thing I kind of take in is this whole light area here. And then maybe if I start looking closer, I can tell, oh, there's a fountain, this is a dragon, it's amazing, it looks magical, it looks mystical, awesome. But it's not really the first thing that kind of jumps at me, right? So this is what I want to fix, especially in this painting. So the first thing I did is change the scale of the dragon, and I did an overpainting for this. You can already tell I have the overpaint folder over here, and I will go through all of the layers that I did, and I will also show you certain parts in a speed paint, because I recorded the overpainting process as well, but I'm just going to walk you through everything that I did. So the first thing I did was scale the dragon up. This immediately kind of tells you, hey, this is the thing we're supposed to look at, right? This is the main character of this illustration. And of course, if you want to, you can always go in and add these beautiful little details up here that kind of explains where the water is coming from inside of the stone, the mountain. But for the sake of this paint over, I just kept it pretty simple. Feel free to add in as many details as you like in the end, if you want to make any changes to this painting, of course, right? So this is the first thing I would do. And then the second thing is to look at the values. If we look at the values, I made this black layer on color mode. Again, I apologize that my Photoshop is in German. I cannot for the life of me change this to English, but it is the color mode. If we look at this in black and white, we can already immediately tell that there's a lot of contrast in this painting between the very dark, like foliage, shrubbery, tree part, and then the very light part with the shrine. So right now, the area that has the highest value contrast is actually the edge of the foliage, because that's where the really dark foliage stops and the very light background dragon shrine begins. So that's naturally where our eyes will kind of go first when I look at this painting, is to the point that has the highest value contrast, and that's around the edge. And I just want to make sure we pull the eye more toward this area. So the first thing I did is lighten up this whole area around the shrine by making an exposure adjustment layer. So you go onto this little thing, you probably know this, but just in case someone who's watching this doesn't, you click on this little thing here, and then there's an exposure layer. In my case, it's German, but it's called exposure in English, I'm pretty sure of that. And that opens up this menu. And what I did is I lightened everything up, and then I kind of erased out the parts in the middle that I didn't want to be even lighter, because this part is already very light. So that already pulled everything together a lot more value-wise. It looks more cohesive this way. There is less contrast, so it is less punchy. But we're gonna add back in some of the contrast now, but we wanna add it back in the areas that actually matter a lot more in terms of storytelling. So what I did is do another exposure layer, and I added some darkness in the areas around the dragon, around the water here, around the shrine in total, to kind of pull focus to that part. So if we zoom out a little bit and look at the values again and kind of compare to what you had before, and I will actually move the dragon out of this so that it doesn't change all the time. This is the change the value alone made. Now it does have less punch for sure, but again, you can always add more contrast in, and this is what we're going to do throughout this overpaint, is just add little specks of contrast into the painting again, but kind of making sure it's in the right space. Next thing I did was do a color balance layer. This is the color balance, again in here, and then color balance is here. And this is what this looks like. It's very subtle. But basically what I did is the lights, I turned a little bit more into the reds, whereas the darks, I actually pulled a little bit more into blues. It's very, very subtle, but it kind of unifies the colors a bit more. And to add back in a little bit more contrast around the dragon, I also added a slight glow to the water and some highlights to the dragon. For the glow, I used a linear dodge adjustment layer here. And then the highlights is really just a really light yellowish color that I put on top, just to add a little bit more color variance into it. And, you know, upping the contrast again. This is what this is all about, just upping the contrast. And I will say, maybe I should have mentioned this before, the fact that beforehand you didn't have that much contrast in this area was not wrong, okay? Nothing you did was wrong. Technically, if something is far away from us, like the shrine is from the viewpoint of the viewer, then things will be lighter and of less contrast. So technically you did exactly the right thing. I just feel like because this is the focal point of the piece, or at least that's how I interpret it, we actually kind of do not want to do the realistic thing. We kind of want to push that focal point a little bit more so that it pops just a little bit more. Another thing we can do to create a stronger focal point is to use composition in a way that favors us and favors the focal point. So what I did here is just very subtly change a few things. I added a few branches here and there that point toward the dragon. A few of the leaves from the trees are also kind of pointing down to the dragon. Very, very basic things. I also very quickly painted that in. If you're gonna do this at home to your piece, obviously do it with a lot more care than I did. The next thing I tackled was the water. I think the water, especially in the foreground, is kind of a wonderful opportunity to add even more flow to the painting, because we can actually put something either in the water or on the water that kind of flows into the dragon. And that can be many different things. I decided to go with some fish, because why not? But this could be leaves that have fallen onto the water that kind of lead the viewer into the dragon. It could be a bunch of water lily pads, it could be fish. It could just be water, but then add a little bit more flow into it. So I just went with some fish, because that's the first idea that came into my mind. And as you noticed, I also just dropped in some images that I found on Google, just because I wanted to keep it very quick for this overpaint. Obviously, if this were my painting, I would paint in the fish themselves, or if I used photos, I would actually paint over the photos a lot more than I did here. Then I tackled the water itself, and for the most part I just added a bit more color variance into it. I just looked up photos of ponds, and I noticed that there are usually a lot more colors than this kind of monotone green that you had going on, and I just wanted the water to look a little bit more magical, I guess, and colorful without taking away from the dragon. And obviously, again, if this were my painting, I would spend a lot more time painting in the water and look at references a lot more closely and spend a lot more time just making sure it looks right and it reads like water. But I think for the sake of this overpainting, this already makes sense. I popped the fish back on top of the water, then I added some highlights on top of the fish. Notice that I only put highlights on top of the fish, because usually the fish, when they're kind of close to the surface, they will only be covered by the highlights and not by any of the dark parts of the water, if that makes any sense. It's just something that I noticed from looking at references. And then lastly, I added some water lily pads just to add a little bit more detail. They're very rough, just using the lasso tool. And that's it. That's what I did with the water. And yeah, that's the overall change I did to the water. If you compare it with before, it's just there's a little bit more movement in there, there's a little bit more color, it feels a little bit more alive and a little bit more magical. And then for the rest of the overpainting, it was just about adding a little bit more details here and there, where I thought maybe we could make it look a little bit more just lived, especially the ground in the foreground. I made it look a little bit more wild and a little bit more overgrown, as well as these stone steps. I added a bit more damage to them, a bit of grass like poking up between the tiles, very, very subtle and very quick. Like, I didn't spend much time at this at all. I just felt that especially like the foreground elements were kind of looking too man-made and too new. And because this shrine looks like it's in the middle of nature, it's kind of overgrown at the side. It doesn't look like something that is carefully tended to, like one of those Japanese stone gardens, right? It looks more like something that's ancient, that has been there for a while. And so I just added a bit more of that nature element in there, that overgrown look. I added a little bit more detail to the dragon. At this point, this is kind of optional, but I just personally felt that we could have even more contrast. I also added some streaks to the water, because I felt like that made it look a little bit more dynamic, like it's actually coming out of the mouth. I added some blue bounce light, which you already had in your original, so this is like something that you already had. I just kind of lost that in the process a little bit with my overpaint, so I added that back in. And then the last thing I did, I was looking at the values again, and I was kind of zooming out, and I noticed that the water in front of the dragon was kind of disappearing if you looked at it in a very small size. And ideally, we always want our paintings to read even at small sizes. So what I did was put a shadow basically behind the water at the base of the dragon, just so that we could then kind of have a little bit more contrast between the waterfall and the stone, so it's very clear even when we're looking from afar that there is something coming out of the mouth of the dragon, there is something going down. We might not be able to tell that it's like a waterfall from that far away, but we can tell that something's going on. And then the absolute last thing was putting just a little bit of color dodge at the edge of the shadow. This is a complete personal preference, but sometimes when you have a shadow shape, the edge of the shadow will actually have a bit of an orange glow to it, and that can make it look really nice. But again, this is just a very quick thing that I did here to just kind of add a little bit more glow and color into it. And yeah, that's it. This is my overpaint and this is your original. And again, your original was extremely successful, extremely skilled, by the way, fantastically executed. I especially love the way that you rendered the foliage. It's amazing. Like I could never, honestly, I couldn't. Like, honest to God, I couldn't. So this is amazing. All I did was tighten up the values and making sure we know what the focal point is. It's all I did here. And again, of course, this is my personal interpretation. This is what I would do to the piece if it were my piece, but ultimately it's yours. So feel free to take on whatever you want out of this. If you don't agree with all of the things that I said, that's totally fine. And yeah, I hope this helped you. Thank you so much for sending this in and trusting me with your precious, precious artwork. I know it's scary, and also letting me post this publicly. Like, that's not an easy thing to do, so thank you for that. And I hope this helped.